All right, welcome to homework time. So, after going through this class or going through this chapter with you guys, I just want to kind of go over these so this way if you have some questions over again on how to do this, or if you missed a class, you kind of know how to do these because we did this in class. So, also maybe a good refresher for those who had missed class or had been in class and may not feel like, oh, I'm 100% groovy with this. So, this homework was basically taking this IP address and answering a couple questions. Because here's things that people struggle with is now I got this block of IP address. How do I apply it? So I just copied a couple things from the slides that we talked about in class on chapter 4 about the different classes of IPs, the mask, so we know all these answers. So as an example here, we're saying that we're given that this is a address 12.0.0.0. And so the ISP, basically our internet provider, gives this IP address of 35.4.4.2/26 and two DNS addresses to use. Okay, so that's what we're given. So here we can see we have a home router. You can think of these two computers hooked up wireless or wired, however you want to think of it, and connected to the internet. Bam. So here's an example of the information we need to know for the PCs. Here we go. So now the question is asked, is this a public, private address? What is the ID, the broadcast, the max amount of host? All right, so here we go. Well, since it's a 12, we know that's a class A because if we remember the chart from one dot anything to 126 dot when anything is a class A address. So we know it's a class A. Okay, so class A supports 16 million. So there we go, maximum host, 16 M's. Awesome. Our broadcast is ironically the address I gave you because that is the first number. Because remember, every IP block has two addresses reserved. The first address usually starts with a 0 unless it's subnetted. If it's not been subnetted, then it's always going to be 0. And then the last address will be 255. Again, if we're not talking about addresses that have been subnetted. So right here, that gives us our two answers. So our ID would be 12.0.0.0. Our broadcast would be 12.255.255.255. Okay, again, remember, 8 bits. We only get, when we add them all up, we get 255. And then let's scroll down. And again, here's the little chart. And our default mask is 255.0.0.0. So again, here we go. We're going to say our mask is 255.0.0. All right. Now we know, there we go. We know that. So one of the things we talked about in class, we talked about, the router. What address is the router going to have? So typically you're either going to use the first or last address. So in class we use the first, and in this I'm going to use the opposite. I'm going to use the last address. So there we go. So we're going to make the router, we're going to make that 12.255.255.254. So that is going to be our gateway. 12.255.255.254. There we go. 12.255.255.254. And remember, if everything's on the same network in this diagram, since the DHCP, the phone book is all on this router, they're going to all have the same address. And therefore, our DNS will be the same address. Our DHCP server will be the same address. And the PCs are going to use the same address. So again, that's going to be 12.255.255.254. And that's going to be 12.255.255.254. Again, the default gateway here is going to be that IP address up there. So the IP address, so technically we're not given the IP address of the default gateway here, but we can think of that as the internal IP. So this is the WAN interface. So we're going to say this would be 35.4.2. And then what is the mask? So we know that is, and we'll dive into that in a moment. So we know that's more than 24. So we know that's 255.255.255. That should be 192, if I remember correctly. And we'll dive into that. So again, here we have the DNS, so that's going to be 1.1, and then 9.9.9. That is for the router. And then the rest of us, for DNS, we're going to use this address because this is where the address of the DNS server and the DHCP server is going to be. So again, that is going to be our DNS. Because the router by default, like a home router, it's pointing to itself for DNS. So that's why it's going to have the same address going across all these. And they're going to have the same gateway. Again, if you do an IP config /all, you'll see that. And we'll take a quick peek in that. So let's look at some of the math and see how we got some of these answers here real quick. But that looks like should be the most. And then here, again, it's just picking some random number that is in the valid range. Remember, we have 16 million addresses, so we can't really go wrong. So as long as you don't go over 255, you're pretty much can get us that right. So we can say 200.2.66, and then this machine can be 12.200.4.66. They're not identical, right? Because the third octet is different. So there we go. All right. And then the default gateway, we can just say, hey, that's going to be that. So there we go. So again, let's just dive into this a little bit. So here we go. We said we had a 26. So we had a 26. Man, that's a fatty pencil. All right, let's try. All right, let's try that. All right, that looks better. So we said we had 26, right? So if you take 8 and divide that by 26, you get 3, which is 24. And then that gives us, what, 2 left. So 3.2. So remember, we're talking about 32 IP address. IP4 is 32 bits. So they're broken out in each 8 bits. That's a quick way of knowing, oh, 255.255.255, when you can divide that in 3 whole sets of blocks of 8s. There we go. So we got 2 left. So if we remember our number line, so we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We got 128, 64, 32, 16, 8, 4, 2, 1. And then we have 2 bytes left over. And remember, masks are from left to right. So then if we add 128 plus 64, that gives us 192. So that's how I came up with the mask of 255.255.255, dot. All right, cool. So that takes care of that. So again, let's look at this address 12. So we said we have 12.0.0.0, and we can represent that as a /8 or 255.0.0.0. So again, when we look at this, we have 255, so that means that is our host. This is, host network. How do we get, 16 million? Again, 256 times 256 times 256 equals 16 million some change. How do we get 256? And that is simply because we're representing the combination from 0 to 256. 0 is a placeholder. It is a value in this. So like in money, it means nothing. Here, there is a value. It's something. It's not nothing. It's something. It's a 1, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. So, again, remember, if we're not subnetting this, always the last number, always all zeros of the host side is going to be our network ID. So 12.12.12 is going to be our ID. And what is an ID used for is when we start getting the advanced topics like routing, getting from one network to another network. Routers take the network ID and advertise that to other places. So like an example, when you type in www.google.com or just google.com, when it looks up that DNS name to the phone book, looks that IP up, and it looks what ID or network it belongs to, and then that router sends it to it. Because we're grouping, all 16 million addresses into a location and sending it that way. So that's why, it just makes sense to call it an ID. And then again, the broadcasting is the last one. So that would be 255.255.255. Again, that is our broadcast. Again, what do we see in common of all these? IDs are even. 0 is an even number. Even though there's nothing there, it is an even number still. 255 is odd because it's a 5 at the end. So therefore, that has to be the broadcast. There we go. Our first usable address would be, so if we scroll up, our first usable address would be 001. The next address would be 12.0.2 and so on. And then once we were done, we would just go, once we gone through 255 combinations, then we would go 0. And keep going. So that's how you can see this address, because a couple people are getting kind of hung up with these zeros. So we would just literally, this 3 would go all the way up to 255, and then we would shift to the next column, and then that would go from 0 to 255 again, and then this column would shift again, and we would keep going. So that's how that would work. So I'm just trying to come up with some ways of explaining it, or at least showing it a little bit, because yes, that's a lot of writing if I would sit here and write it. So that's why I'm doing the little dash saying, okay, from 3, we would continue in theory and keep writing this sequentially to 255 and then switch over. All right, hopefully this helps you understand the homework. Again, I will, try to have some more videos again if you have questions or have topics that you feel like it would help in class that are class related for, would be good video tutorials or how-tos. Let me know. All right, see you in the next one.